Recently, I celebrated the 50th anniversary of Nixon's resignation by holding up a copy of the Sacramento Union, one of two major newspapers in Sacramento back in the 70s. The more popular one being the Sacramento Bee. So I want to reflect on newspapers. I delivered both papers when I was a kid, when I was in high school, age 16 through maybe 18. I was delivering both the Sacramento Bee and the Sacramento Union on two different paper routes at the same time, every morning, like every morning, including Saturday and Sunday. And so I did that for really more like 13 or 14 months. I did it on purpose just to put on my resume that I worked from 78 through 80 for the Sacramento Bee and the Sacramento Union, my two first official jobs. So I was the news, what I was called a newspaper boy back then. And I didn't mind. I thought that was a cool title back then, especially for a kid. And I felt a sense of responsibility and power that I was the one delivering the news to all these people in my neighborhood, and that they relied on me to get them the news every morning. Every now and then I would miss a house. I had like probably 150 houses on each route. So delivered to 300 different homes, and there was overlap. Some people got the Union and the Bee, but let's just say it was about 300, at least a couple hundred homes every morning, like even Sunday, with big thick papers, which often took 2 trips. Anyway, that was my first job, first thing learning about money, what to do with money, and it was a media job. Because let's face it, if I didn't collect from each house that I delivered to, then the Bee or the Union didn't get paid. It was as simple as that. And of course, they would have gotten rid of me had I not paid them. But the way it worked was big trucks would come to my home every morning, dump off the newspapers in big bundles, and I'd have to break open those bundles and then fold each paper and put a rubber band around it. So that took some time. I think that took about an hour. And then delivering the papers, that took another hour. And it was mainly in my neighborhood. Yeah, it was completely in my neighborhood, like within a mile of where I lived. And I had a friend at that time who went to both of my different high schools. I went to JFK and then Rio Americano. But one person named Leslie, she was in both high schools, and she turned out to be a paper girl at that time in an adjacent neighborhood. And so she delivered the Bee and the Union as well. So we were thinking double back then as far as getting paid. I think it was $300 a month per paper is what I got. So I made about $600 back then in the late 70s, $600 a month off my 2 paper routes. But anyway, the Sacramento Bee and the Union, 2 things that seem like they're part of the distant past. Just like in every major city, a lot of newspapers have either disappeared or, in the case of the Sacramento Bee, got taken over by a Wall Street hedge fund. That's what happened to the Sacramento Bee after the family-owned business called McClatchy, McClatchy News Service, McClatchy Newspapers. That company name survived in their bankruptcy. They filed bankruptcy, and it got taken over by a hedge fund who bought out, I guess, most of it. And it's still called McClatchy, though, even though the family does not own a controlling interest in it anymore. So again, that company went bankrupt, and Chatham Asset Management bailed them out. Now that's the same company that owned a company called American Media Incorporated a while back, and they own the National Enquirer. And it was the National Enquirer, that tried to make Trump, how do you put it? They were friends with Trump. The head of the National Enquirer was friends with Trump and wanted to protect Trump because a lady named Karen McDougal agreed to give her story to the National Enquirer for $150,000, and that money was somehow handled through American Media Incorporated, but somehow the fingerprints include Michael Cohen, the attorney for Donald Trump. So somehow it turned into hush money, and the story wasn't printed. And it didn't make it on their any of their publications. So that became a scandal, like a hush money scandal. And then the company, Chatham Asset Management, was fined by the Securities Exchange Commission. It just added up to a lot of money and fines and stuff, and they finally got rid of the company that owned National Enquirer, or they had that company sell off National Enquirer. That's what it was, to avoid any more association with their their kind of what's called checkbook journalism, where you pay for sources for stories. Who would have thought it would be as high as $150,000? Apparently, Chatham or the head of the company, AMI, had set a limit to of $10,000 to pay sources, and so this went way beyond the limit, which red flagged it, and now it's a story in history. And so that's kind of the shady side of hedge funds, and now they own media outlets. And I don't know, it raises the question, how objective is that type of media? Chatham Asset Management has been associated with the Republican Party in the past as far as donations. However, in recent years, they have given more money to the Democratic Party. So anyway, the Sacramento Bee. Yeah, my first employer, kind of, sort of. I guess it was an independent contract sort of thing, where they gave me the papers, and I agreed to deliver them to each of the houses. If I missed a house, I'd have to go buy a paper at the newsstand to replace it. And that back then it was like 10 cents or something. Now it's $3. But then again, inflation and all that has changed prices drastically since the late 70s. So anyway, that was my first media experience, was delivering papers for the Sacramento Bee, which started in 1857. It was a family business all that time. And I also delivered the Sacramento Union, which was an older paper that started in 1851. And that publication went out of business in 1994. It couldn't compete with the Sacramento Bee. Sacramento Bee always endorsed Democratic candidates. I shouldn't say always, but they predominantly did, whereas the Union mainly endorsed Republican candidates. So you get the slant of, and my family subscribed to both at one time or another. So I grew up understanding the Bee and the Union, and that the Bee was probably the more popular paper because it had more news. It was a lot thicker paper, even though the photos were black and white back in the 70s, versus the Union, which was a nice color photo publication, but it was a lot thinner, and you didn't feel like you were getting much news out of it, like it was super censored news or something, or they just couldn't afford it. It was owned by Copley News Service at the time, and maybe they had to downsize the company. They just didn't want to put the funds into it that B had. B had like, you know, that B sold lot more advertising, and that made it a thicker paper as well, a lot more ads. So yeah, it's a far cry from today where the B is just this thin, smaller paper, and it's hard to say how many people subscribe to it anymore. I can't find any data on it, but I used to know that the publication or the circulation of the Sacramento Bee was well over 200,000 in Northern California. Like, it delivered to other cities as well. And the company McClatchy, they own the Fresno Bee and the Modesto Bee and other publications, and they own radio stations. McClatchy owned KFBK until I think late 70s. And then they own the TV station KOVR. A lot of laws changed as to, and FCC regulations as to how many media properties a media company could own, but they loosened the rules back up in 1996. By then, we were kind of moving toward the internet era, and media was changing so much that, it's just hard to distinguish between then and now, because nowadays a lot of people don't read the newspaper. And I couldn't even tell you how many people still read the print copy that I see available for $3, the much thinner, smaller copies at supermarkets. Like Safeway carries it, and I noticed it at Bel Air, which is owned by Rayleigh's. I don't really read it much. I bought a copy recently just to check it out, see how it compares to the old days of newspapers. But I think the influence of newspapers has very much gone downhill and been reduced compared to what it was in the 70s. 70s, it was still pretty strong. Like, newspaper endorsements could help political candidates back then. I don't know if they matter anymore. But it seems to me that in Sacramento, the top news source wouldn't be the Sac Bee anymore. At one time, I would say it was, especially even through the 90s maybe. But the internet era just took a big chunk out of that and changed everything. I would say it's the TV station KCRA and, their website, kcra.com. I would think that's one of the top media sources for Sacramento local news these days. Something I think that's very interesting in Sacramento Bee's history is the fact that they had one of the first women editors of all time in the news industry, newspaper industry. And that was Eleanor McClatchy, who took over the Bee in 1936 and ran it until the 1970s. And she actually knew President John F. Kennedy during his term, and actually sat next to him at a group of California publishers back in 1963, and she was the only woman in the room out of like about 40 people. And she was able to talk JFK into getting what she wanted. She didn't like the fact that I-5, Interstate 5, was about to be built, and the state wanted to plow through Old Sac, and she was opposed to that. So she got JFK to withhold federal funding for highway spending until the state rerouted the route. And so now, I-5, once it was built, it was adjacent to Old Sac instead of plowing through it and destroying it. I should point out that when I was a kid, I liked newspapers. I wanted to create my own newspaper, and I did for my parents for a while, from the 73 to 74 period. And so I'd listen to the radio, write down news, and then put it in my hand-drawn newspaper. And then one day, my mom took me on a tour of the Sacramento Bee in downtown Sacramento. And I got to see how the paper was made. I got to see printing presses for the first time, and I learned a lot about the paper, and including the fact that the logo for the bee, the actual bee cartoon, came from Walt Disney in the 1940s. Another great memory I have of the Sacramento Bee is that they regularly interviewed me. So Dan Vieira's radio column sometimes would feature some of my quotes about the station, Quad 106.5 in Sacramento, because we were really changing things in the 90s. There hadn't been a station to achieve what we had done successfully, which was to play music alternative to the mainstream. Anyway, that's kind of my reflections on newspapers. They used to be like one of the top influential cultural forces that we knew about as far as local culture. You can, if you got mentioned in the Sacramento Bee as a new business, it could really bring a lot of business to you in a hurry. So anyway, that gives you an idea of how strong local media can be, especially in helping the local scene. So that should do it for now. Let's talk again for another Riverside Chat.